The dust kicked up from the road like smoke from a dying fire as Ellis Brand stumbled toward the farmhouse. Each step a testament to how far a man could fall and still keep walking. His coat hung heavy on his shoulders, not from the weight of the wool, but from the weight of what stained it dark crimson, dried now but still speaking of violence in its silent, accusing way. The sun was setting behind him, casting long shadows that seemed to reach toward the modest wooden structure ahead, as if even the light knew he needed somewhere to hide. Ellis had been walking for 3 days straight, sleeping in ditches when exhaustion finally claimed him, drinking from streams when he found them, and eating nothing but the bitter taste of regret. His face was gaunt, stubbled with days of neglect, and his eyes held the hollow look of a man who had seen too much death and caused too much of it himself. The farmhouse appeared before him like a mirage, small and humble, but somehow radiating the kind of warmth he hadn't felt since Mercy died in his arms 6 months ago. He didn't know why his feet had carried him here, to this particular place, down this particular road. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was desperation, or maybe it was something deeper, something that pulled wounded souls toward places where healing might be possible. The farm looked well-tended despite its modest size, with neat rows of vegetables visible in the garden, chickens pecking contentedly in their enclosed yard, and smoke rising straight and true from the chimney, speaking of a fire kept burning by someone who cared about making a home rather than just occupying a house. As he approached the front steps, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. The last 3 days had been a blur of running, hiding, and trying to stay ahead of Crane's men who wanted him dead or alive, preferably dead, for what he'd done to protect his wife's memory. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd killed a man to defend Mercy's honor only to become the very thing she'd always feared he might become. A killer, a fugitive, a man without a home or hope. The porch steps creaked under his weight as he climbed them, each board singing its complaint about supporting another broken soul. He raised his hand to knock, then hesitated, suddenly aware of how he must look, how he must smell, how the blood on his coat would appear to whoever opened that door. What kind of man brought violence to a stranger's threshold? What kind of man asked for sanctuary when he had none to offer in return? Before he could knock, the door opened, and Ellis Brand found himself looking down at a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She had bright blonde hair that caught the last rays of sunlight like spun gold, and blue eyes that seemed far too knowing for someone so young. She looked at him without fear, without judgment, just with the kind of curious acceptance that children possessed before the world taught them to be afraid of strangers. "Mama says you can stay," June said simply, as if she'd been expecting him all along, as if wounded men appeared on their doorstep every evening and were welcomed with the same matter-of-fact kindness that she might show to a stray cat or an injured bird. Ellis stared at her, certain he'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Mama says you can stay," June repeated, stepping aside and holding the door open wider. "She saw you coming up the road from the kitchen window. Says you look like a man who needs supper and a safe place to sleep." From somewhere inside the house came the sound of footsteps, and then a woman appeared behind the little girl. Clara was perhaps 30 years old, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun and green eyes that seemed to see straight through to a person's soul. She wore a simple blue dress with an apron tied around her waist, and her hands showed the calluses of someone who worked hard to keep her small world functioning. There was something in her bearing that spoke of loss weathered and survived, of strength found in the midst of sorrow. "June's right," Clara said, her voice warm but cautious. "You look like you've been traveling hard. When's the last time you had a proper meal?" Ellis opened his mouth to speak, then found he had no words. The kindness was so unexpected, so undeserved, that it hit him like a physical blow. He'd prepared himself for doors slammed in his face, for fear and suspicion and the cold shoulder that a man like him had earned. He hadn't prepared himself for a little girl who spoke as if his arrival had been foretold, or for a woman who looked at his blood-stained coat and offered him supper instead of turning him away. "I don't," he began, then stopped. The truth was, he couldn't remember his last real meal. Hardtack and jerky didn't count as food, not really. "Ma'am, I appreciate the offer, but I should warn you. I might bring trouble to your door." Clara studied his face for a long moment, her green eyes taking in the exhaustion, the desperation, the carefully controlled fear that he was trying so hard to hide. "Mister, it seems to me that trouble has already found you. The question is whether you're the kind of man who brings harm to those who help him, or the kind who's grateful for a chance to rest and maybe find his way back to being human again." Ellis felt something crack inside his chest, some wall he'd built around his heart to keep the pain from overwhelming him entirely. This woman, this stranger, was offering him exactly what he needed most. Not just food and shelter, but the possibility of redemption, the chance to remember what it felt like to be treated like a man rather than a hunted animal. "I'm the second kind," he said quietly. "At least, I hope I am." Clara nodded as if that settled the matter. "Then come inside. June, go wash your hands for supper. We're having pot roast tonight, and there's plenty for 3. As Ellis followed them into the farmhouse, he caught sight of his reflection in the hallway mirror and nearly recoiled from what he saw. His face was drawn and haggard, his clothes were torn and stained, and his eyes held a wildness that spoke of too many nights sleeping rough and too many days looking over his shoulder. He looked exactly like what he was, a dangerous man on the run. But when he looked at Clara, bustling around her small kitchen with quiet efficiency, setting an extra place at the wooden table without fanfare or fuss, he saw something he'd almost forgotten existed. Mercy had possessed it too, that rare quality of seeing past the surface of things to the heart underneath. It was the kind of grace that didn't ask questions about the blood on a man's coat, but instead asked whether he preferred his coffee black or with cream. The kitchen was warm and filled with the smell of home cooking, with herbs hanging from the rafters to dry and preserves lined up on shelves like colorful soldiers standing at attention. A fire crackled cheerfully in the hearth, and the whole room seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a life lived with purpose and care. It was everything Ellis had lost when Mercy died, everything he'd thought he'd never find again. June set the table with the careful precision of a child who'd been taught to do things properly, her small hands placing each fork and knife exactly where it belonged. She hummed softly to herself as she worked, a tune Ellis didn't recognize but that seemed to speak of contentment and security, of a world where little girls could hum while they set tables because they knew their mother would always be there to cook the food that would fill the plates. "Sit," Clara instructed gently, nodding toward one of the chairs. "You look like you're about to fall over." Ellis sat gratefully, his body sinking into the wooden chair as if it were the most comfortable throne ever created. The simple act of sitting at a table set for a meal, of being welcomed into the warm circle of lamplight and domesticity, was almost overwhelming in its normalcy. For months now he'd lived like an animal, sleeping where he could, eating when he had to, always moving, always running, always afraid. Clara ladled pot roast onto his plate, the meat falling apart at the touch of her spoon, surrounded by potatoes and carrots that had been cooked to perfect tenderness. The smell alone was enough to make his mouth water and his stomach clench with hunger he'd been trying to ignore. She added a thick slice of bread, still warm from the oven, and a generous pat of butter that began to melt immediately upon contact. "Thank you," he said, and the words came out rougher than he'd intended, thick with emotion he was trying to keep contained. "Don't thank me yet," Clara replied with a small smile. "Wait until you taste it. June helped with the seasoning, and she has a heavy hand with the salt." June giggled, a sound like silver bells in the lamplight. "I do not. You're the one who always says food should taste like something." As they ate, Ellis found himself relaxing for the first time in months. The food was perfect, seasoned with care and cooked by someone who understood that a meal could be an act of love, a way of saying welcome and stay, and you matter without using any words at all. Clara and June chattered quietly about their day, about the chickens that had gotten loose that morning and the garden that would need weeding tomorrow, normal domestic concerns that felt like glimpses into a life he'd thought was lost to him forever. But even as he ate, even as he felt the knots in his shoulders beginning to loosen and the sharp edge of panic starting to dull, Ellis couldn't forget what he was carrying. The blood on his coat had dried, but it was still there, still speaking of the violence that followed him like a shadow. Every few minutes, his eyes would drift to the windows, checking for signs of pursuit, for the dust cloud that would announce Crane's men had found him again. Clara noticed his nervousness, the way his gaze kept shifting to the door, the way his hand remained always within reach of the gun at his hip. She didn't comment on it directly, but her own posture became slightly more alert, her own awareness expanding to include whatever danger he might be bringing to her home. "The blood on your coat," she said finally, her voice carefully neutral. "Is it yours?" Ellis set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone despite the excellent food. "No, ma'am, it's not." "I see." Clara continued eating as if he'd just commented on the weather. "Are you hurt anywhere? I have some medical supplies if you need tending." The casual way she offered help, without condemnation or fear, nearly undid him completely. "I'm not hurt. Not where it shows, anyway." Clara nodded as if she understood exactly what he meant. The wounds that don't show are often the ones that take longest to heal. After supper, Clara showed him to a small room off the kitchen that she explained had once been used for storage but could serve as sleeping quarters. It contained a narrow bed with clean sheets, a washstand with fresh water, and a window that looked out over the darkening fields. It was simple and clean and more welcoming than any palace could have been. "There's soap and towels," Clara said, indicating the washstand. "And if you need anything during the night, don't hesitate to call out. June and I are light sleepers." Ellis stood in the doorway, overwhelmed by the simple kindness of it all. "Ma'am, I have to ask, why are you doing this? You don't know me. You don't know what I might have done." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her gaze drifting to something beyond his shoulder, something in the past that he couldn't see. "I know what it's like to be alone," she said finally. "I know what it's like to need help and not know where to find it. And I know that sometimes the difference between a good man and a bad one is whether anyone gives him a chance to be good." As she turned to leave, Ellis found his voice again. "What happened to your husband?" Clara paused in the doorway. "Fever took him 2 winters ago. It was quick, which was a blessing, I suppose, but it left June and me to manage the farm alone. And some days that feels like more than we can handle." "I'm sorry for your loss." "And I'm sorry for yours," she replied, though he hadn't told her about Mercy. Perhaps loss recognized loss, perhaps sorrow called to sorrow across the space between hearts. "Good night, Ellis. Sleep well." Alone in the small room, Ellis sat on the edge of the bed and tried to process what had happened to him. For months, he'd been running from place to place, never welcome anywhere, never safe anywhere, always moving because staying meant risking capture or death. And now, inexplicably, he'd found himself taken in by strangers who asked no questions and expected nothing in return except basic human decency. He pulled off his coat and looked at the bloodstains that marked him as clearly as any brand. The blood belonged to Jake Morrison, one of Crane's men, who'd made the mistake of speaking about Mercy in terms that no husband should ever have to hear. Ellis had killed him with his bare hands, driven by a rage so pure and consuming that it had frightened him even as it filled him with savage satisfaction. Now Morrison was dead, and Ellis was a wanted man, and Clara and June had welcomed him into their home, as if he were a prodigal son returning rather than a killer seeking shelter. The contrast between what he deserved and what he'd received was so stark it made his chest ache with something he couldn't name. Outside his window, the night settled over the farm like a gentle blanket, bringing with it the sounds of country evening. Crickets singing, owls calling, the distant lowing of cattle settling down for sleep. It was peaceful in a way that Ellis had almost forgotten was possible, the kind of peace that came from being in a place where people cared for each other and for the land that sustained them. But even as he felt himself beginning to relax, even as his eyelids grew heavy with the first real drowsiness he'd experienced in weeks, Ellis couldn't shake the feeling that this sanctuary was temporary. Crane wouldn't give up easily, wouldn't let the death of one of his men go unpunished. Sooner or later, the violence that followed Ellis like a storm cloud would catch up to him, and when it did, it would threaten this peaceful place and these good people who had shown him kindness when he needed it most. As he finally lay down on the clean sheets and pulled the handmade quilt up to his chin, Ellis made himself a promise. However long he stayed here, however long Clara and June were willing to shelter him, he would do everything in his power to protect them from the darkness he carried. They had given him a gift more precious than gold. the chance to remember what it felt like to be human again. The least he could do in return was ensure that his presence didn't destroy the haven they had created. Part 2. The Bloody Trail, Section 3. Morning came too soon and not soon enough. Ellis woke before dawn, his body trained by months of running to never sleep too deeply, never rest too completely. The soft light filtering through the gingham curtains felt alien after so many nights under stars or in abandoned barns, and for a moment he couldn't remember where he was. Then the smell of bacon frying drifted under his door, and reality settled around him like a warm embrace he didn't deserve. Clara was already in the kitchen when he emerged, her hair pinned up efficiently and her apron tied tight around her waist. She moved with the practiced rhythm of someone who'd been managing a household alone for 2 years, every motion economical and purposeful. June sat at the table, swinging her legs and chattering about a dream she'd had involving talking chickens and a cow that could fly. "Morning," Clara said without looking up from the stove. "Hope you slept better than you have in a while." Ellis had slept better, deeper than he had since Mercy died, but he'd also dreamed. Dreams of blood and gunfire, of Morrison's face as life left his eyes, of Crane's cold smile promising retribution that would follow Ellis to the ends of the earth. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." She set a plate before him loaded with eggs, bacon, and biscuits that were still steaming from the oven, along with a jar of honey that caught the morning light like liquid amber. The food was simple but perfect, the kind of breakfast that spoke of caring hands and attention to detail, of someone who understood that a good meal could be an act of love. As they ate, Clara's eyes kept drifting to his coat, hanging on a peg by the door where the dried blood showed dark against the worn wool. She didn't ask about it directly, but Ellis could see the questions forming behind her careful composure. She was a smart woman, too smart not to recognize the signs of violence when they were hanging in her own kitchen. After June finished eating and went out to feed the chickens, Clara poured herself another cup of coffee and settled back in her chair, her green eyes fixed on Ellis with an intensity that made him shift uncomfortably. "That blood on your coat," she said finally. "It's not from a hunting accident, is it?" Ellis set down his fork, his appetite suddenly gone despite the excellent food. He'd known this moment would come, had dreaded it even as he'd hoped he could somehow avoid it. "No, ma'am, it's not. Someone's looking for you." It wasn't a question, and Ellis saw no point in denying what she'd already figured out. "Yes, ma'am, they are." Clara nodded slowly, as if confirming something she'd suspected all along. "Are you a good man who did a bad thing? Or a bad man trying to fool me into thinking otherwise?" The question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was cruel but because it was fair. It was exactly what she should be asking, exactly what any sensible woman with a child to protect would need to know. "I don't know anymore," he said honestly. "I used to think I was good. My wife certainly thought so. But good men don't usually end up with other people's blood on their clothes. Tell me what happened." Ellis looked out the window toward the chicken coop where June was scattering feed, her young voice singing some half-remembered song that drifted through the glass like a fragment of innocence. "My wife died 6 months ago. Fever, same as your husband. I blamed myself, thought maybe if I'd gotten the doctor sooner, if I'd done something different." He trailed off, lost in the familiar maze of guilt and regret. "But that's not why you killed someone." Ellis flinched at her directness, at the way she cut straight through to the heart of things without mercy or evasion. "No, that came later. After the funeral, when I was trying to figure out what to do with myself, where to go, how to live without her. I ended up in a saloon in Millfield, drinking too much and feeling sorry for myself." Clara waited, her face carefully neutral, giving him space to tell the story in his own way. "There were some men there, cowboys working for a man named Crane who owns most of the cattle ranches in 3 counties. They'd had too much to drink, and they started talking about women they'd known, getting crude about it. One of them, Jake Morrison, he mentioned my Mercy by name. Said things about her that—" Ellis's hands clenched into fists on the table. "Said things no man should ever say about another man's wife, living or dead. So you killed him." "I told him to take it back, to apologize. He laughed at me, said a dead woman couldn't care what anyone said about her." Said maybe he'd visit her grave sometime, pay his respects in his own way. Ellis's voice had gone flat, emotionless, the way it always did when he thought about that night. I hit him, just meant to shut him up, make him stop talking about her like that. But he went down hard, hit his head on the edge of the bar, broke his neck. Clara absorbed this information without visible reaction, though Ellis saw her fingers tighten slightly around her coffee cup. And now his boss wants you dead. Crane doesn't care about Morrison particularly. Man was nothing but hired muscle. But he can't have people thinking they can kill his men and walk away. It's bad for business, bad for his reputation. So he put a price on my head and sent his best trackers after me. Outside, June's singing had stopped, replaced by the contented clucking of chickens and the distant sound of cattle moving in a neighboring field. The normalcy of it, the peaceful rhythm of farm life continuing its ancient patterns, made Ellis's violent past seem like something from another world entirely. How long before they find you here? Clara asked. Ellis met her eyes, saw no judgment there but also no false comfort. I don't know. I've been careful, covered my tracks as best I could. But Crane's got resources, connections. He'll keep looking until he finds me or until something else more important comes along. Clara stood and walked to the window, looking out at her small domain with the calculating gaze of someone assessing what might be lost. June doesn't know any of this. No reason she should. I'll be gone before they get close, before there's any danger to you or her. Clara turned back to him, her expression fierce with a protectiveness that reminded Ellis painfully of Mercy when she defended the stray animals that always seemed to find their way to their door. You think running is going to solve this? You think Crane's men won't hurt us just because you're not here when they arrive? The thought hit Ellis like ice water in his veins. In his desperation to find sanctuary, in his gratitude for their kindness, he'd somehow convinced himself that his presence wouldn't endanger them. But Clara was right, of course. Men like Crane didn't make fine distinctions between the guilty and the innocent. They would assume Clara and June had helped him, had information about where he'd gone. They would do whatever was necessary to extract that information. I never meant to put you in danger, he said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. I know you didn't, but danger's here now regardless of what you meant. Clara returned to the table, her movement decisive. The question is what we do about it. We. You think I'm going to let them hurt my daughter because some cattle baron wants revenge? You think I'm going to roll over and let them destroy what I've built here? Clara's eyes blazed with a determination that transformed her from a simple farm woman into something far more formidable. My husband died defending this land from men who thought they could take what they wanted. I'm not about to let his sacrifice be meaningless. Ellis stared at her, struck by the steel beneath her gentle exterior, by the way she'd shifted from questioning his presence to accepting it and planning their defense. Clara, you don't understand what you're up against. Crane's got money, influence, men who'll do anything he tells them to do. And I've got something he doesn't, Clara replied firmly. I've got something worth fighting for. Part 3, Outside Threat, Section 4. The riders appeared on the horizon just after noon, 3 of them moving at an easy pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. They knew their quarry was cornered, knew there was nowhere left to run. Ellis spotted them first from the barn where he'd been helping Clara repair a broken stall door, the dust cloud on the road catching his attention like a signal fire announcing the end of peace. Clara, he called quietly, his voice carrying the tension of a man who'd learned to recognize danger from a great distance. Company coming. She straightened from where she'd been examining the door hinges, wiping her hands on her apron with movements that were too controlled, too careful. How many? 3. Maybe a quarter mile out. Clara's face went pale but her voice remained steady. June's in the house doing her lessons. I need to get her somewhere safe. They moved quickly but without panic, Ellis following Clara into the farmhouse where June sat at the kitchen table, carefully forming letters on a slate with the tip of her tongue poking out in concentration. She looked up when they entered, her bright eyes immediately picking up on the tension that crackled between the adults. What's wrong? She asked, setting down her chalk. Nothing's wrong, sweetheart, Clara said, though her hands were already gathering up June's schoolwork with swift efficiency. We're just going to play a game. Remember how Papa used to tell you about the hiding place under the house? June nodded solemnly. She was young but not stupid, old enough to understand that when adults spoke in careful, controlled voices and moved with sudden purpose, something serious was happening. I want you to go there now and stay quiet until Mama comes to get you. Can you do that for me? Yes, Mama. June slipped off her chair and headed for the trapdoor, hidden beneath a braided rug in the corner of the kitchen. Ellis helped Clara lift the heavy panel, revealing a small space that had clearly been prepared for exactly this kind of emergency. There were blankets down there, a water jug, and even a few books to keep a frightened child occupied. No matter what you hear, Clara told her daughter as June climbed down into the hiding space. You stay hidden until I come for you. Promise me.
Y promise, Mama.
They replaced the trapdoor and the rug just as the sound of hoofbeats reached the front porch. Ellis checked his revolver, making sure it was loaded and ready, while Clara moved to the kitchen window and peered out through the curtains. 3 men, she confirmed. Well-armed, well-dressed. They look like they mean business. Ellis joined her at the window, recognizing the type if not the specific individuals. Crane's men all had a certain look about them, a professional hardness that came from years of doing whatever was necessary to maintain their boss's control over his territory. These 3 were no exception. Lean, weathered men with cold eyes and guns worn easy on their hips. A loud knock echoed through the house, followed by a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to having doors opened when he demanded it. Mrs. Hartwell? We'd like a word with you, ma'am. Clara and Ellis exchanged glances. Somehow they knew her name, had done their research before riding out here. That meant they weren't just following Ellis's trail blindly. They were being methodical, professional. It also meant they probably knew about June. Clara straightened her shoulders and walked to the front door, Ellis positioning himself just out of sight in the kitchen doorway where he could see and hear everything but remain hidden unless circumstances forced him to reveal himself. She opened the door but didn't step outside, maintaining the defensive advantage of the threshold while presenting herself as a harmless farm woman with nothing to hide. "Gentlemen, what can I do for you?" The leader of the 3 was a tall man with graying hair and a mustache that had been carefully waxed into points. His clothes were expensive but practical, the outfit of someone who could afford the best but needed it to be functional. When he smiled, it didn't reach his eyes. "Ma'am, my name is Samuel Hartridge. I work for Mr. Crane, and we're looking for a man who might have passed this way recently. Dangerous fellow wanted for murder. We have reason to believe he might have sought shelter hereabouts." Clara's face remained carefully neutral, giving away nothing. "I haven't seen any strangers lately. What did this man look like?" Hartridge described Ellis with uncomfortable accuracy, down to the scar on his left hand and the way he favored his right leg when he walked. Someone had been watching him for a long time, learning his habits, his weaknesses, his tells. "You're certain you haven't seen anyone matching that description?" Hartridge pressed, his tone remaining polite but gaining an edge that suggested politeness was a limited commodity. "I'm certain," Clara replied firmly. "Like I said, we don't get many strangers out this way. Tends to be pretty quiet." One of the other men, younger than Hartridge but with the same cold professionalism, stepped forward. "Ma'am, we're going to need to search your property. Just to be thorough, you understand." Ellis tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. This was the moment when things would either resolve peacefully or explode into violence. And he could see from Clara's posture that she wasn't going to step aside and let them ransack her home. "I'm afraid I can't allow that," Clara said, her voice steady despite the danger she was placing herself in. "This is private property, and you have no legal authority here." Hartridge's smile became more predatory. "Ma'am, we don't need legal authority when we're hunting a killer. Now, you can make this easy on yourself and your little girl, or you can make it hard. But either way, we're going to search this place." The mention of June sent a chill through Ellis that had nothing to do with fear for his own safety. These men knew about the child, were prepared to use her as leverage if necessary. The careful politeness was a facade, a thin veneer over the threat of violence that they were perfectly willing to employ. Clara's chin lifted defiantly. You'll find nothing here because there's nothing to find. And if you think you can intimidate me with threats against my daughter, you've seriously misjudged the situation. Ellis made his decision. Remaining hidden might have been the smart tactical choice, but it wasn't the right moral one. These men had come here because of him, had threatened Clara and June because of the violence that followed in his wake. The least he could do was face that violence directly rather than letting innocent people suffer for his sins. He stepped into the doorway, his gun drawn but not yet aimed. A clear statement of presence and intent without quite crossing the line into open hostility. The lady asked you to leave, gentlemen. Might be best if you listened to her. Hartridge's eyes lit up with satisfaction, the expression of a hunter who'd finally cornered his prey. Ellis Brand, you've led us quite a chase, my friend. I'm not your friend, Ellis replied calmly, and I'm asking you politely to ride out of here and leave these people alone. Your quarrel is with me, not with them. Oh, but you see, that's where you're wrong. Hartridge's hand drifted toward his gun, a casual movement that was anything but casual. Mrs. Hartwell here has been harboring a fugitive, which makes her an accessory to murder. And accessories need to be dealt with just as firmly as principals. The threat was clear, the line drawn in sand that was already stained with blood. Ellis felt the familiar cold calm settling over him, the same deadly focus that had gotten him through the war and through the violent years that followed. He'd hoped never to feel it again, but some tools, once learned, were never truly forgotten. Last warning, he said quietly. Ride away now, or this ends badly for everyone. Hartridge laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Son, you're outnumbered 3-1, and we know there's a little girl in that house who'll suffer if you do anything stupid. You think you're going to outdraw all three of us and protect your new friends at the same time. Ellis's response was interrupted by the unmistakable sound of a shotgun being cocked behind him. Clara had retrieved her husband's old double-barrel from wherever she kept it hidden, and now she stood in the doorway beside Ellis, the weapon held with the competence of someone who knew how to use it. Actually, she said conversationally, I think the odds just got a little more interesting. Part 4. The Night Attack, Section 5. The standoff lasted exactly 17 seconds, though it felt like 17 hours to Ellis as he watched the calculation flicker behind Hartridge's eyes. 3 professional gunmen against a wounded fugitive and a farm woman with a shotgun. The odds still favored Crane's men, but not by enough to guarantee they'd all walk away from the encounter. In the end, it was pragmatism rather than cowardice that made Hartridge step back. This isn't over, Brand, he said, his voice carrying the promise of future violence. Mr. Crane doesn't forget, and he doesn't forgive. You can't protect them forever. I don't need forever, Ellis replied quietly. Just long enough. The 3 riders withdrew, but not far. Ellis watched from the kitchen window as they made camp in a grove of cottonwoods about half a mile down the road, close enough to keep the farmhouse under observation but far enough away to avoid any legal complications if the local sheriff happened to ride by. They were settling in for a siege, patient as buzzards waiting for something to die. Clara lowered the shotgun but didn't set it aside, her knuckles white where they gripped the worn wooden stock. They're not leaving. No, Ellis agreed. They're not. They'll wait until dark, then come back with more men. Hartridge isn't the type to risk his neck in a fair fight when he can stack the odds in his favor. June's voice drifted up from beneath the floorboards, muffled but audible. Mama? Can I come out now? Clara knelt and lifted the trapdoor, helping her daughter climb out of the cramped hiding space. June's face was pale but determined, the expression of a child who'd learned too young that the world could be a dangerous place, but who refused to let that knowledge break her spirit. Are the bad men gone? June asked, brushing dust from her dress. For now, Clara replied, smoothing down her daughter's blonde hair with gentle fingers. But they might come back tonight, so we need to be ready. Ellis spent the afternoon preparing for what he knew was coming. He checked every window and door, looking for weak points and defensive advantages. The farmhouse was solidly built but hadn't been designed as a fortress. There were too many ways in, Too many angles of approach that couldn't be adequately covered by two people with limited ammunition. Clara proved to be a capable ally, displaying a practical knowledge of firearms and tactics that spoke of hard lessons learned during the difficult years after her husband's death. She showed Ellis where the extra ammunition was stored, helped him move furniture to create better firing positions, and demonstrated a clear understanding of what they were up against. "Samuel fought in the war," she explained as they worked. "Confederate cavalry under Nathan Bedford Forrest. He told me stories about fighting from farmhouses, about how to make a small force seem larger than it was." As the sun began to set, painting the western sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Ellis uncomfortably of fire, Clara prepared what might be their last meal together. She cooked with the same careful attention to detail she'd shown that first night, as if maintaining the rituals of normal life could somehow hold back the violence that was coming for them. June helped set the table, her small hands placing each fork and knife with the precision of someone who'd been taught that doing things properly mattered, even when the world was falling apart around you. She chattered about the chickens and her lessons and a story she'd been reading, maintaining the innocent normalcy of childhood even as the adults prepared for war. They ate by lamplight, the windows shuttered and barred against the darkness outside. Ellis found himself memorizing the scene. Clara's face golden in the flickering light, June's bright laughter at something her mother had said, the warm smell of biscuits and honey, the sense of family and belonging that he'd thought he'd lost forever when Mercy died. "Whatever happens tonight," he said quietly when June had gone to her room to play with her dolls, "I want you to know that these past few days have meant more to me than I can say. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have again." Clara reached across the table and covered his hand with hers, her fingers warm and steady. "You gave us something too. You reminded us that we didn't have to face everything alone." The attack came at midnight, heralded by the acrid smell of smoke drifting through the shuttered windows. Ellis woke instantly, his soldier's instincts pulling him from sleep to full alertness in the space of a heartbeat. The barn was on fire, flames dancing against the night sky like demons, celebrating some infernal victory. "Clara!" he called, rolling out of bed and grabbing his gun. "They're here." She was already awake, already moving, the shotgun in her hands and her face set in lines of grim determination. "June!" But June was already running toward them, her nightgown white as a ghost in the darkness, her eyes wide with fear but not with panic. She'd been prepared for this moment, had understood what the strange men's visit that afternoon really meant. "The root cellar," Clara said, lifting the trapdoor again. "Same as before, sweetheart. No matter what you hear, you stay hidden until one of us comes to get you." "What if neither of you comes?" June asked with the terrible clarity that children sometimes possessed. Clara knelt and took her daughter's face in her hands, looking directly into those bright blue eyes. "Then you wait until morning and you run to the Garrett place. Miss Hattie will take care of you." The first gunshot shattered the kitchen window, sending glass cascading across the floor like deadly snow. Ellis pushed Clara down behind the overturned table they'd positioned as cover, then returned fire through the broken window. Muzzle flashes bloomed in the darkness beyond the burning barn. At least 6 of them, maybe more. "They brought friends," Ellis muttered, ejecting the spent cartridge and feeding a fresh round into the chamber. Clara's shotgun boomed, the double load of buckshot shredding the front door and sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Someone screamed in pain beyond the threshold, a sound of agony that was quickly cut short by another voice shouting orders. "Brand, you hear me in there?" Hartridge's voice carried over the sound of crackling flames and sporadic gunfire. "Send out the woman and child, and we'll make this quick for you." Ellis's response was a carefully aimed shot that punched through the wooden wall near where he'd heard the voice. The answering silence suggested his message had been received and understood. The battle settled into a deadly rhythm. Probing attacks followed by fierce responses, the sound of breaking glass and splintering would punctuated by the sharper crack of rifle fire. Ellis found himself falling back into patterns learned during the war, moving from position to position, never staying in one place long enough for the enemy to fix his location. Clara proved to be a deadly partner, her shotgun devastating at close range and her knowledge of the house's layout allowing her to anticipate where the next attack would come from. She moved through the darkness like a wraith, appearing at windows to deliver punishing volleys before disappearing again into the protective shadows. But they were vastly outnumbered, and Ellis could feel the noose tightening around them as Crane's men worked their way closer to the house. A bullet grazed his shoulder. Another shattered a lamp inches from his head, filling the air with the smell of kerosene and the danger of fire. Then the back door exploded inward, and 3 men rushed through the opening with guns blazing. Ellis spun to meet them, his revolver barking twice before something sledgehammered into his chest and sent him stumbling backward into the kitchen table. Clara's shotgun roared, cutting down the lead attacker, but the other 2 kept coming, their faces twisted with bloodlust and the promise of easy money. Ellis tried to raise his gun, tried to protect the woman who'd shown him kindness when he'd needed it most, but his arm wouldn't obey his commands and his vision was starting to gray around the edges. Part 6. The Desperate Escape, Section 6. The world narrowed to a tunnel of pain and flickering consciousness as Ellis felt his life ebbing out through the hole in his chest. He could hear Clara screaming his name, could see June's terrified face peering up through the partially open trapdoor, could smell smoke and blood and the sharp cordite tang of gunpowder. But it all seemed to be happening at a great distance, as if he were watching someone else's tragedy unfold. Clara's voice cut through the haze like a blade. "Ellis, stay with me." She was beside him now, her hands pressed against the wound in his chest, trying to stop the bleeding that was painting her nightgown crimson. Her face was streaked with soot and tears, but her eyes blazed with a fierce determination that refused to accept defeat. The surviving attackers had been driven back by her devastating shotgun work, but Ellis could hear them regrouping outside, could hear Hartridge shouting orders for more men to circle around to the front of the house. They had maybe minutes before the next assault, maybe less. "Can you move?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the chaos surrounding them. Ellis tried to answer, tried to tell her to take June and run while she still could, but all that came out was a wet cough that sprayed blood across his lips. The bullet had found something vital, something that couldn't be patched up with bandages and wishful thinking. But Clara wasn't accepting that verdict. She'd seen men survive worse wounds during the war, had helped her husband nurse wounded soldiers back to health in the terrible years when death visited every household and hope became a luxury few could afford. "June," she called, "I need you to help me get Ellis to the cellar." The little girl climbed out of her hiding place without hesitation, her small face set in lines of concentration that made her look far older than her 8 years. She took Ellis's feet while Clara supported his shoulders, and together they managed to get him down into the cramped space beneath the kitchen floor. The cellar was larger than it had appeared from above, extending back under the house far enough to accommodate all 3 of them with room to spare. Clara's husband had built it as a storm shelter, but he'd also prepared it as a refuge against other kinds of storms, the humankind that sometimes swept across the frontier with guns and torches and hearts full of hatred. There were medical supplies down here, Clara discovered, along with food, water, and ammunition that Samuel had stockpiled against an uncertain future. She lit a small oil lamp, the wick turned low to minimize the light, and began examining Ellis's wound with hands that shook only slightly despite everything they'd endured. "It's bad," she said quietly, her fingers probing the edges of the bullet hole with professional competence. "But it missed your heart and lungs. If we can stop the bleeding and keep infection out, you might make it." Ellis wanted to tell her not to waste time on him, wanted to insist that she take June and flee while Crane's men were distracted by the burning barn. But when he tried to speak, Clara pressed a finger to his lips and shook her head. "Don't you dare," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you dare give up on me now. June needs you, and God help me, so do I." Above them, the sound of gunfire had stopped, replaced by the ominous crackle of flames and the sound of boots moving across the kitchen floor. Hartridge's voice drifted down through the floorboards, muffled but audible. "Search every inch of this place. They can't have gotten far." June pressed herself against Ellis's uninjured side, her small body trembling with fear but her eyes bright with unshed tears that she refused to let fall. She was her mother's daughter, Ellis realized, possessed of the same stubborn courage that had led Clara to stand up to armed men rather than betray a stranger who'd sought shelter under her roof. Clara worked over Ellis's wound with quiet efficiency, cleaning it as best she could with the limited supplies available and binding it with strips torn from her nightgown. The bleeding slowed but didn't stop entirely, and Ellis could feel his strength ebbing like water from a cracked vessel. "There's something else," Clara whispered as she worked. Samuel left instructions, maps showing safe routes to places where we could find help. "There's a woman named Hattie Garrett who lives about 10 miles north of here. She's helped people before, people running from trouble they didn't deserve." Ellis tried to focus on her words, tried to process the information through the fog of pain and blood loss. "The Garrett place? She's a healer, and she doesn't ask questions about how people got hurt or why they need her help. If we can get there, she might be able to save you." The sound of furniture being overturned echoed from the kitchen above, followed by cursing as Crane's men searched for the hiding place they knew had to exist. It was only a matter of time before someone thought to look for a concealed trapdoor, only a matter of time before their sanctuary became a tomb. Clara must have realized the same thing because she began gathering supplies with swift, silent efficiency. The medical kit, what food she could carry, ammunition for both the shotgun and Ellis's revolver. June helped without being asked, her small hands packing items into a canvas bag with the careful attention to detail that had been drilled into her by 2 years of helping her mother manage a farm alone. "There's a tunnel," Clara whispered, indicating a dark opening at the far end of the cellar that Ellis hadn't noticed before. "Samuel dug it during the war. Connects to a natural cave system about 50 yards from the house. If we can make it that far without being seen." Ellis knew he was in no condition to crawl through tunnels or make desperate escapes through hostile territory, but he also knew there was no choice. Staying here meant death for all of them. Moving meant death was only probable rather than certain. Clara helped him sit up, biting back a cry of pain as the movement sent fresh agony through his chest. June took his good arm and tried to support him, her small strength barely adequate to the task but her determination absolute. They moved through the tunnel in single file, Clara leading the way with the dim oil lamp, Ellis crawling behind her on hands and knees while fighting waves of nausea and dizziness, June bringing up the rear with the supply bag clutched against her chest like a shield against the darkness. The tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, a claustrophobic nightmare of dirt walls and low ceiling that pressed down on them like the weight of the earth itself. Ellis's wound reopened during the crawl, painting a trail of blood behind them that would make their escape route obvious to anyone who found it. But eventually they emerged into a natural cave that opened onto a hillside overlooking the burning remains of Clara's farm. The barn was completely engulfed now, and flames were beginning to lick at the farmhouse roof. Crane's men moved through the orange-tinted darkness like demons, searching for prey that had somehow slipped through their fingers. "We need to keep moving," Clara said, though Ellis could see the exhaustion in her face, could hear the strain in her voice. "It won't be long before they find the tunnel." Ellis tried to stand and immediately collapsed, his legs refusing to support his weight. The blood loss was worse than Clara had initially thought, and the crawl through the tunnel had aggravated his injuries beyond his body's ability to compensate. "Go," he whispered, the word barely audible even in the cave's silence. "Take June and go. I'll slow you down, get you both killed." Clara's response was to slip his arm around her shoulders and haul him upright through sheer force of will. "I've lost one good man already," she said grimly. "I'm not losing another." And so they set out into the night, a wounded man, a determined woman, and a brave little girl, fleeing through hostile territory toward the uncertain promise of sanctuary. Behind them, Clara's farm burned like a funeral pyre for the life they'd tried to build together. Ahead lay 10 miles of dangerous country and the hope that Hattie Garrett would prove to be the angel of mercy that Clara believed her to be. Ellis leaned heavily on Clara as they stumbled away from the cave, each step a conscious act of will over a body that wanted nothing more than to lie down and surrender to the darkness that kept trying to claim him. But June walked beside them, her small hand clasped in his, and somehow that connection to innocence and hope gave him the strength to keep moving. The night was vast and full of dangers, but they were alive, they were together, and they were free. For now that was enough. Part 5. The Journey to Salvation, Section 7. The 10 miles to Hattie Garrett's place stretched before them like an eternity measured in blood and determination. Ellis faded in and out of consciousness as they walked, his weight supported almost entirely by Clara's surprising strength and stubborn refusal to let him fall. June walked beside them like a small sentinel, her eyes constantly scanning the darkness for signs of pursuit. Her young ears tuned to every sound that might herald the approach of Crane's men. They followed deer paths and creek beds, avoiding the main roads where riders might spot them even in the darkness. Clara navigated by starlight and memory, recalling conversations with Samuel about the network of good people who could be trusted to help those fleeing from injustice. The Garrett place was legendary among those who knew to look for it. A sanctuary run by a woman who'd lost everything in the war and had dedicated her remaining years to ensuring others didn't suffer the same fate. Ellis's condition worsened with each passing hour. The makeshift bandages Clara had applied were soaked through with blood, and his skin had taken on the gray pallor that spoke of a body pushed beyond its limits. Twice he collapsed completely, forcing Clara to slap him back to consciousness, while June kept watch for pursuers who might be drawn by their voices. "I can't," he whispered during the second collapse, his voice barely audible above the sound of wind through the trees. "Clara, I can't go any farther." "Yes, you can," she replied fiercely, hauling him upright again with strength that seemed to come from somewhere beyond the physical. "You can because June needs you to, because I need you to, because giving up now means everything we've been through was for nothing." June took his hand in both of hers, her small fingers surprisingly warm in the cold night air. "Ellis," she said with the matter-of-fact confidence that only children possessed, "Mama says people who give up don't get to see tomorrow, and tomorrow might be the best day ever." Somehow, impossibly, he found the strength to keep walking. Not because his body was capable of it, but because these two extraordinary females refused to let him surrender to the darkness that kept trying to claim him. Clara's arm around his waist was like an anchor to the world of the living, and June's chatter about everything and nothing was a lifeline back to hope. They crested a ridge just as dawn began to paint the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold, and there below them lay their destination. A modest cabin nestled in a grove of ancient oaks, with smoke rising from the chimney and the warm glow of lamplight visible through windows that promised safety and healing. Hattie Garrett emerged before they'd even reached the front porch, as if she'd been expecting them. She was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that came from seeing too much suffering and choosing compassion over cynicism. She wore a simple dress covered by a leather apron, and her hands showed the stains of someone who worked regularly with medicinal herbs and healing compounds. "Clara Hartwell," she said without preamble, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. "I saw the smoke from your place last night. Figured you might be heading this way." Clara nearly collapsed with relief at being recognized, at finding someone who understood their situation without lengthy explanations. "Miss Hattie, he's hurt bad. Gunshot to the chest. I've done what I could. But you need someone with real medical knowledge," Hattie finished, already moving to support Ellis's other side. "June, sweetheart, run ahead and open the door. We need to get this man inside before he bleeds out on my front porch." Hattie's cabin was larger inside than it appeared from outside, with rooms that had been specifically designed for medical work. The main room contained a sturdy table that could serve as an operating surface, shelves lined with bottles and jars containing every medicinal herb known to frontier medicine, and surgical instruments that gleamed with the care of someone who understood their importance. They laid Ellis on the table, and Hattie immediately began cutting away his blood-soaked shirt to examine the wound. Her fingers probed with professional competence, and Ellis could see her cataloging the damage with the calculating gaze of someone who'd treated countless gunshot wounds during the war. "Bullets still in there," she announced after her examination. "Lodged against a rib, which probably saved his life by keeping it from reaching his heart. But it's got to come out, and he's lost a lot of blood." Clara gripped Ellis's hand tightly. "Can you save him?" Hattie's expression was grim but not hopeless. "I can try, but it's going to be touch and go for a while. June, I need you to help me gather supplies. Clara, you're going to assist with the surgery. What followed was 3 hours of delicate, dangerous work that pushed both Ellis's body and Hattie's skills to their absolute limits. The bullet had indeed lodged against his rib, fragmenting on impact and sending pieces of lead through his chest cavity that had to be painstakingly located and removed. Ellis drifted in and out of consciousness throughout the procedure, occasionally surfacing to the sound of Hattie's calm voice giving instructions to Clara, who proved to be a capable surgical assistant despite having no formal medical training. June stayed nearby, her small hands ready to pass instruments or hold basins, her presence a constant reminder of why Ellis needed to survive this ordeal. "There," Hattie said finally, dropping the last fragment of lead into a metal basin with a sound like a bell tolling. "That's all of it. Now we just have to hope infection doesn't set in and that his body has enough fight left to heal itself." She cleaned and stitched the wound with neat, precise movements, then bandaged it with strips of clean linen that had been boiled to kill any harmful bacteria. Ellis was unconscious by then, his breathing shallow but steady, his color slightly better than it had been when they'd arrived. "Will he live?" Clara asked quietly. Hattie washed her hands in a basin of hot water, considering her answer carefully. "The next 48 hours will tell. If he makes it through without fever or infection, he's got a good chance. But it's going to be a long recovery either way." Part 6. The Healing Time, Section 8. Ellis spent the next week floating between consciousness and fevered dreams, his body fighting battles on multiple fronts as it struggled to heal from the trauma it had endured. Clara never left his side, sleeping in a chair beside his bed and waking at the slightest change in his breathing or the first sign that his condition might be deteriorating. June appointed herself as his official guardian, reading to him from storybooks when he was awake enough to listen and singing soft lullabies when the pain became too much for him to bear. Her presence seemed to have a healing effect beyond anything in Hattie's medical arsenal, her childish optimism and absolute faith in his recovery providing an anchor to hope when the darkness threatened to overwhelm him. Hattie proved to be exactly the kind of person Clara had described, a healer who asked no questions about how her patients had come to need her services, who judged people by their character rather than their circumstances, and who possessed medical skills that would have been impressive in any big city hospital. She'd learned her craft during the war, treating soldiers from both sides without regard for the uniform they wore, and had continued practicing her healing arts long after the last battle had been fought. "You're lucky," she told Clara during one of Ellis's quieter moments. "An inch higher and that bullet would have punctured his lung. An inch lower and it would have torn through his liver. Either way, he'd be dead by now." Clara smoothed Ellis's hair back from his fevered forehead, her touch gentle and proprietary. "He's stronger than he looks, stronger than he thinks he is." "Strength of body, maybe," Hattie observed. "But what about strength of spirit? Man like that, carrying the guilt he's carrying, sometimes they don't want to heal. Sometimes they think dying would be easier than living with what they've done." It was true, Clara realized. Even in his delirium, Ellis's mumblings often returned to themes of guilt and unworthiness, of blood on his hands and violence following him like a shadow. He'd killed a man, had brought danger to innocent people, had caused the destruction of everything Clara had worked to build. The physical wounds would heal, but the spiritual ones might prove more difficult to address. On the 8th day, Ellis's fever finally broke. He woke to find Clara dozing in the chair beside his bed, June curled up like a kitten on a blanket in the corner, and Hattie quietly preparing medications at a table near the window. The sight of them all together, safe and whole and bathed in morning sunlight, was almost overwhelming in its simple beauty. "Clara," he whispered, his voice hoarse from days of fever and delirium. She woke instantly, her eyes immediately focusing on his face with the alertness of someone who'd been listening for the slightest change in his condition. "Ellis, oh thank God. How do you feel?" "Like I've been shot," he replied, managing a weak smile. "But alive. Definitely alive." June bounced up from her blanket, fully awake and beaming with joy. "Ellis, you're better. I knew you would be. I told Mama you were too stubborn to die." Hattie approached the bed with her professional demeanor intact, but Ellis could see the relief in her eyes as she examined his wound and checked his vital signs. Color's good, she announced. Fever's gone. Wound is healing cleanly. You're going to make it, Mr. Brand. The next few weeks passed in a haze of gradual recovery and quiet domesticity. Ellis's strength returned slowly but steadily, and soon he was able to sit up for extended periods, then to walk short distances around Hattie's cabin, then to venture outside for brief periods in the fresh air and sunshine. Clara and June settled into the routine of life at the Garrett place with remarkable ease, helping with daily chores and contributing to the small community of healing that Hattie had created. Other people came and went, wounded souls seeking sanctuary, travelers in need of medical attention, families fleeing from various forms of persecution, and all were welcomed with the same non-judgmental compassion that had saved Ellis's life. During the long afternoons of his convalescence, Ellis found himself talking with Clara about things they'd never discussed before: their childhoods, their dreams for the future, their fears about what lay ahead. She told him about Samuel, about the love they'd shared and the life they'd built together before fever claimed him. He told her about Mercy, about the guilt he carried over her death and the rage that had driven him to kill Jake Morrison. "You think I'm a good man who did a bad thing, or a bad man trying to fool himself into thinking he's good?" he asked one afternoon as they sat on Hattie's front porch, watching June play with a litter of puppies that had been born to Hattie's old hound dog. Clara considered the question seriously, as she considered all serious questions. "I think you're a man who loved his wife so much that losing her nearly destroyed you. I think you're a man who defended her honor when someone spoke of her disrespectfully, and that speaks to your character, not against it. And I think you're a man who spent so much time punishing himself for being human that you've forgotten what it means to forgive yourself." Ellis felt something ease inside his chest, some knot of guilt and self-recrimination that had been tied so tightly for so long that he'd forgotten it was there. "What happens now?" he asked. "I mean, after I'm fully healed. Crane's men are still out there. They won't stop looking for me." "Then we deal with Crane," Clara said simply. "Together. All of us." "Clara, you don't understand what you're saying. These aren't reasonable men who can be negotiated with. They're killers, and they won't stop until I'm dead or they are." Clara turned to look at him directly, her green eyes blazing with the same fierce determination he'd seen the night they defended her farm. "Ellis Brand, I watched my home burn because I chose to protect you instead of turning you over to men who wanted to hurt you. I crawled through tunnels and walked 10 miles through hostile territory because I believed you were worth saving. Do you really think I'm going to abandon you now, just when things are getting interesting?" June looked up from the puppies, her young face serious. "Besides," she added with the matter-of-fact logic that children specialized in, "Mama says we're a family now, and families stick together no matter what." Ellis stared at them both, these two extraordinary females who'd taken a broken, guilty man and somehow decided he was worth loving despite all the reasons he'd given them not to. For the first time since Mercy's death, he began to believe that maybe, just maybe, he deserved a second chance at happiness. "A family," he repeated softly, testing the word like a prayer. "A family," Clara confirmed. "If you want it." Ellis reached out and took her hand, then extended his other hand to June, who abandoned the puppies immediately to join their small circle. "I want it," he said quietly. "God help me. I want it more than anything." And sitting there on Hattie Garrett's front porch, with the afternoon sun warming their faces and the sound of June's laughter filling the air, Ellis Brand began to believe that maybe redemption was possible after all. Maybe love really could conquer the darkness that had threatened to consume him. Maybe family really was stronger than the forces of hatred and revenge that had driven him from his old life. Maybe, just maybe, they could build something beautiful from the ashes of what they'd lost. Part 7. The Enemy Returns, Section 9. 3 weeks into Ellis's recovery, when his strength had returned enough for him to help with daily chores and his wound had healed to the point where he could move without constant pain, the peace they'd found at Hattie's place was shattered by the arrival of unwelcome news. It came in the form of Tom Bradley, a local farmer who served as an unofficial messenger for the scattered homesteads in the area. Bradley rode up to Hattie's cabin just after dawn, his horse lathered with sweat and his face grim with the kind of expression that announced bad tidings before he'd even opened his mouth. Ellis was splitting firewood behind the cabin when he heard the hoofbeats, and something in the urgent rhythm of the approaching horse made him set down his axe and move toward the front of the house. "Miss Hattie," Bradley called as he dismounted. "I got word you need to hear. That cattle baron, Crane, he's been asking questions around Millfield, offering money for information about a wounded man traveling with a woman and child." Ellis felt his blood turn to ice water in his veins. He'd known this moment would come, had tried to prepare himself for it, but the reality of Crane's renewed pursuit still hit him like a physical blow. Clara emerged from the cabin behind him, June at her side, both of them immediately understanding the significance of Bradley's message. "How much is he offering?" Hattie asked, her voice carefully neutral. $500, Bradley replied, his eyes flicking nervously toward Ellis. "Dead or alive," he says, "and another 100 for anyone who helps capture the woman and child." Clara stepped closer to Ellis, her hand finding his with the automatic gesture of someone offering support in the face of danger. June pressed against his other side, her small body radiating the kind of fierce loyalty that made Ellis's heart ache with love and fear in equal measure. "Did anyone take his money?" Clara asked, her voice steady despite the obvious threat. Bradley shook his head. "Not yet, but $500 is more money than most folks around here see in 5 years. There's bound to be someone willing to sell information for that kind of reward." Ellis felt the familiar weight of guilt settling over him like a shroud. Once again, his presence was putting innocent people in danger. Once again, the violence that followed him like a shadow was threatening to destroy everything good that he'd managed to find. "I have to leave," he said quietly. "I have to draw them away from here before someone gets hurt." "The hell you do," Clara replied with the kind of vehemence that made both Bradley and Hattie blink in surprise. "We've been through this already, Ellis Brand. Running isn't going to solve anything." Hattie stepped forward, her healer's instincts clearly warring with her practical understanding of the danger they all faced. "Tom, how long ago did you hear this?" "Yesterday evening. Crane and his men were in Millfield Saloon, buying drinks for anyone willing to listen to their story about hunting a dangerous killer. They're planning to start searching homesteads today, working their way outward from where they think you might have gone." Ellis did rapid calculations in his head. Millfield was 15 miles away, and there were perhaps a dozen homesteads between there and Hattie's place. If Crane's men searched systematically, they had maybe 2 days before the net closed around them. "There's something else," Bradley continued reluctantly. "Crane's brought his sister with him this time. Woman named Victoria Crane. Has a reputation for being even meaner than her brother. Word is she's the one pushing for revenge. Won't let him forget that someone killed one of his men and got away with it." June tugged on Ellis's shirt, her young face serious with the weight of adult concerns that no child should have to carry. "Ellis, are the bad people coming back?" Ellis knelt down to her level, looking into those bright blue eyes that held such trust and faith in his ability to protect her. "They might be, sweetheart. But I promise you, I won't let anything happen to you or your mama." "I know," June replied with the absolute confidence that only children possessed. "Mama says you're the bravest man she's ever known, and brave people don't let bad things happen to their families." The simple faith in her voice nearly broke Ellis's heart. This child, who'd already lost her father and her home, was depending on him to keep her safe from dangers that existed solely because of his past actions. The responsibility was overwhelming, but it was also clarifying. Whatever else happened, whatever sacrifices had to be made, June and Clara would survive this ordeal. Hattie had been listening to the conversation with the calculating expression of someone weighing options and assessing risks. "Tom," she said finally, "I need you to carry some messages for me, quietly, and only to people you trust completely." Bradley nodded, understanding that he was being recruited into something larger than a simple message service. "Go to the Henderson place, the Morrison farm, the other Morrison, not the one that got killed, and the Williams homestead. Tell them Hattie Garrett is calling in old favors. Tell them we've got good people in trouble, and it's time to decide whether we're going to let bullies with money terrorize our neighbors or whether we're going to stand up for what's right." Ellis stared at her in amazement. Miss Hattie, you can't ask these people to risk their lives for me. I'm not worth that kind of sacrifice. Hattie's expression was fierce with the kind of righteous anger that had probably driven her to become a healer in the first place. Ellis Brand, you listen to me and you listen good. This isn't about you anymore. This is about whether we're going to let men like Crane think they can ride into our territory and terrorize decent folks just because they have money and guns. Clara squeezed Ellis's hand tighter. She's right. This stopped being just about you the moment Crane's men burned down my farm and threatened my daughter. Now it's about all of us, about whether we're going to stand together or let them pick us off one by one. Bradley mounted his horse, his face set with the determination of someone who'd made up his mind to do something dangerous but necessary. I'll spread the word, Miss Hattie. How long do you think we have? Not long enough, Hattie replied grimly, but maybe long enough to be ready for them when they come. As Bradley rode away to carry Hattie's messages, Ellis found himself looking at the women and child who'd become his family with a mixture of love and terror that made his chest tight. They were preparing to fight for him, to risk everything they had because they believed he was worth saving. The knowledge was humbling and terrifying and inspiring all at once. "What can I do to help?" he asked, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. Clara smiled at him, the expression transforming her face from merely pretty to absolutely radiant. "You can stop trying to protect us by running away and start helping us figure out how to win this fight." June nodded seriously. "Mama's really smart about fighting bad people. She has lots of good ideas." And so they began to plan, 3 adults and 1 remarkably mature child, preparing to face an enemy who had more men, more money, and more firepower than they could hope to match. But they had something Crane didn't have. They had each other, they had the support of their community, and they had the kind of righteous anger that came from defending home and family against those who would destroy both. Part 8. The Final Stand, Section 10. Crane arrived at Hattie's place 2 days later, just as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of orange and red that reminded Ellis uncomfortably of fire and blood. But this time, he wasn't alone and wounded, hiding in the darkness and hoping to avoid confrontation. This time, he stood on Hattie's front porch with Clara beside him and June safely hidden in the cabin's reinforced root cellar, ready to face whatever came with the strength that came from fighting for something worth dying for. Hattie had transformed her healing sanctuary into a fortress with the kind of efficiency that spoke of hard-won experience. Windows had been reinforced with heavy shutters, furniture had been moved to create defensive positions, and weapons had been distributed to everyone capable of using them. The neighbors who'd answered her call for help were positioned around the property in carefully chosen spots that would allow them to provide covering fire while remaining concealed from attackers. Ellis counted at least 8 riders approaching, their silhouettes dark against the dying light. Crane himself was easy to identify by his expensive clothes and the way he sat his horse like a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Beside him rode a woman who could only be his sister Victoria, her bearing radiating the kind of cold authority that spoke of someone who enjoyed inflicting pain on others. "Ellis Brand," Crane called out when the riders had stopped just outside effective rifle range. "I know you're in there. Come out and face justice like a man." Ellis stepped forward to the edge of the porch, making himself visible but keeping the cabin's walls within easy reach if he needed cover. "I'm here, Crane. What do you want?" "What I've always wanted," Crane replied, his voice carrying clearly across the distance between them. "Justice for Jake Morrison. You killed one of my men, and that demands an accounting." "Morrison got what he deserved," Ellis called back. "He spoke about my dead wife in terms that no decent man would use, and I made him answer for it." Victoria Crane urged her horse forward a few steps, her face twisted with the kind of hatred that had been nursed and cultivated until it had become the defining characteristic of her personality. "Your wife was a whore who died like a dog," she spat, "and you're going to join her before this night is over." Ellis felt rage flare in his chest like white-hot metal, but Clara's hand on his arm reminded him that losing his temper now would only give their enemies an advantage. "Say what you want about me," he replied evenly, "but leave the dead out of it." Crane raised his hand for silence, his eyes scanning the cabin and surrounding area with the calculating gaze of someone assessing defensive positions and estimating enemy strength. I'm going to give you one chance, Brand. Come out with your hands up, and I'll make sure the woman and child aren't harmed. And if I don't, then we burn this place down around your ears, and everyone inside dies with you. Hattie stepped out of the cabin behind Ellis, her medical bag in one hand and her late husband's rifle in the other. Mr. Crane, she called out, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent years commanding respect in life and death situations. This is my property, and these are my guests. You have no legal right to threaten them or me. Legal right? Victoria Crane laughed, the sound like breaking glass. We're the law out here, old woman. We decide what's legal and what isn't. Actually, said a new voice from the gathering darkness, I think I'll be the judge of that. Sheriff Tom Dillard rode into the circle of lamplight, his badge glinting in the flickering illumination and his hand resting casually on the butt of his revolver. Behind him came 3 deputies, all armed and looking like men who'd made up their minds to do their duty regardless of the personal cost. Ellis felt a surge of hope mixed with confusion. He'd never met Dillard personally, but the sheriff's reputation for fairness and integrity was legendary throughout the territory. If Dillard was here, it meant someone had sent word about what was happening, had asked for official intervention in what had been shaping up as a private war. Sheriff, Crane said, his voice carefully controlled but edged with irritation. This is a private matter. That man is wanted for murder. Actually, Dillard replied conversationally, he's not. I received a telegram this morning from the territorial judge in Millfield. Seems there were witnesses to the fight between Mr. Brand and Jake Morrison, witnesses who testified that Morrison started the altercation and that Mr. Brand acted in self-defense. Ellis stared at the sheriff in amazement. Witnesses? Bartender and 2 customers who were in the saloon that night. Took them a while to work up the courage to come forward, but when they heard about the price you had on your head, they decided it was time to tell the truth. Dillard's gaze shifted to Crane, his expression hardening. Which means you've been hunting an innocent man, Mr. Crane, and that makes you the criminal in this situation. Victoria Crane's face contorted with rage at seeing her carefully planned revenge slipping away. This is a setup. You're in league with them. Ma'am, Dillard replied with exaggerated patience. I'm in league with the law, and the law says Mr. Brand is innocent of any crime. He looked around at Crane's men, his hand moving more obviously toward his weapon, which means anyone who tries to harm him will be committing assault at the very least, murder if they succeed. Crane sat his horse in frustrated silence, clearly struggling with the collapse of his justification for pursuing Ellis. Without the cover of seeking justice for a murdered employee, his actions became nothing more than vigilante harassment of an innocent man. But Victoria Crane wasn't interested in legal niceties or official pronouncements of innocence. Her hatred had grown beyond rational bounds, had become a consuming obsession that wouldn't be satisfied by anything less than Ellis's death. I don't care what your badge says, she snarled at Dillard. That man humiliated my family, killed one of our people. He's going to pay for that whether it's legal or not. She drew her gun with surprising speed, the weapon clearing leather and swinging toward Ellis before anyone could react. But Clara was faster, her husband's old revolver appearing in her hand as if by magic and barking once in the lamplight. Victoria Crane tumbled from her saddle, clutching her shoulder and screaming curses that would have made a dock worker blush. Her gun flew wide, the shot going harmlessly into the darkness beyond the cabin. Next one goes through your heart, Clara announced calmly, her weapon trained on the wounded woman with steady hands. I suggest you and your brother collect your men and ride out of here before I decide you're too dangerous to leave alive. Crane looked around at his men, at the sheriff and his deputies, at the rifle barrels that had appeared at windows and from behind trees as Hattie's neighbors revealed their positions. He was outnumbered, outgunned, and completely without legal justification for his presence. Continuing the fight would accomplish nothing except getting his remaining men killed. This isn't over, he said finally, his voice thick with frustrated rage. Yes, it is. Ellis replied quietly. It's over, Crane. Jake Morrison is dead. I've been cleared of any crime, and your sister just committed assault with a deadly weapon in front of a sheriff and 3 witnesses. If you're smart, you'll take her and ride out of here before Sheriff Dillard decides to arrest the whole lot of you. Crane stared at him for a long moment, hatred and calculation warring in his expression. Then he dismounted and helped his wounded sister back onto her horse, his movements sharp with barely controlled fury. Mount up, he ordered his men. We're leaving. As Crane's riders disappeared into the darkness, Ellis felt something ease in his chest that had been tight for months. The pursuit was over, the danger was past, and he was finally free to build the life he'd found with Clara and June without constantly looking over his shoulder for enemies who wanted him dead. Dillard approached the porch, his expression friendly but professional. Mr. Brand, I'm going to need you to come into town tomorrow and make a formal statement about everything that's happened, just for the official record. Of course, Sheriff. And thank you. I don't know how you knew to come here tonight, but your timing was perfect. Dillard smiled. Thank Miss Hattie's friend Tom Bradley. He rode 20 miles to fetch me, said there were good people in trouble and that the law needed to step in before innocent folks got hurt. Ellis looked around at the faces surrounding him. Clara with her fierce protective love, June peeking out from the cabin doorway with bright, curious eyes, Hattie with her healer's compassion, the neighbors who'd risked their lives to help strangers simply because it was the right thing to do. These people had become his family, his community, his reason for living. They'd taken a broken, guilty man and shown him that redemption was possible, that love really could conquer the darkness that threatened to consume everything good in the world. Sheriff, he said quietly, I think I'm ready to come home now. Epilogue. New Beginnings. Section 11. 6 months later, Ellis stood in the doorway of the new farmhouse they'd built together on the land where Clara's original home had burned. It was larger than the old house, with a proper bedroom for June and a spacious kitchen where Clara could work her domestic magic. But it retained the same feeling of warmth and welcome that had made Ellis feel at home from his very first night under Clara's roof. The fields were green with new crops, the barn housed livestock that would see them through the coming winter, and the garden bloomed with vegetables and flowers that June had planted with the careful attention of someone who understood that growing things required patience and faith in tomorrow. Clara emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh biscuits, her hair gleaming in the afternoon sunlight and her face radiant with the kind of contentment that came from building something meaningful with someone you loved. She'd agreed to marry him a month ago, after he'd finally worked up the courage to ask properly, and the wedding was planned for the following spring when the wildflowers would be blooming and the whole world would be celebrating the renewal of life. June ran up from the garden where she'd been playing with the new litter of puppies they'd acquired from Hattie's old hound dog. Her dress was dirty, her hair was escaping from its braids, and her face was bright with the kind of happiness that only children could achieve when they felt completely safe and loved. Ellis, she called, launching herself into his arms with the absolute confidence that he would catch her. Look what I found. She showed him a 4-leaf clover she'd discovered among the regular clover near the garden, holding it up like a treasure more valuable than gold or silver. Mama says 4-leaf clovers bring good luck, she announced seriously. And we've had lots of good luck lately, so maybe this one will bring us even more. Ellis hugged her close, breathing in the sweet scent of childhood that clung to her hair and clothes. I think we've already had all the good luck any family could ask for, sweetheart. There's no such thing as too much good luck, June replied with the matter-of-fact wisdom that she specialized in. Besides, Mama says good luck is just another word for blessings, and Pastor Williams says blessings are supposed to be shared with other people. Clara set down the tray and joined their small family group, her arms encircling both Ellis and June in the kind of embrace that spoke of security and belonging and home. They stood there together in the doorway of their rebuilt life, watching the sun set over fields they'd planted with their own hands, listening to the sound of cattle lowing in the distance and chickens settling down for the night. You know what I love most about this place? Clara asked quietly. What's that? Ellis replied, though he suspected he already knew the answer. It's ours. Not because we inherited it or bought it or conquered it, but because we built it together from nothing. Because we took the ashes of what we'd lost and used them to create something new and beautiful and strong. Ellis nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. This wasn't just a farm or a house or a piece of property. This was proof that love really could triumph over hatred, that hope really could overcome despair, that families could be created by choice and commitment rather than just blood and circumstance. June wriggled out of their embrace and ran toward the kitchen, her young voice calling back to them, "Come on! Supper's getting cold, and I want to tell you about the story I'm writing for school." Ellis and Clara followed her inside, hand in hand, their footsteps echoing in the hallway of the home they'd built together. Behind them, the sun finished setting over their land, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that spoke not of fire and destruction but of warmth and promise and the endless possibility of tomorrow. In the kitchen, June chattered excitedly about her story, an adventure tale involving brave farmers who fought off bandits and lived happily ever after, while Clara served supper and Ellis listened with the contented expression of a man who'd finally found his place in the world. They were a family now, not bound by blood but by something stronger. The shared experience of facing danger together, of choosing love over fear, of building something beautiful from the ruins of what they'd lost. Ellis Brand had started his journey as a broken man fleeing from his past, but he'd ended it as a husband and father with a future worth fighting for. As they sat around the table sharing their evening meal, Ellis looked at Clara's face glowing in the lamplight and June's bright eyes sparkling with excitement over her story, and he knew with absolute certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. They were home now, all of them, and home was not a place but a promise to love and protect and cherish each other through whatever storms might come. Outside, the night settled gently over their farm like a blessing, bringing with it the peaceful sounds of a world at rest. Crickets singing, owls calling, the distant sound of the creek running clear and clean toward a future full of infinite possibility. And inside their warm kitchen, a family born from loss and hardship and the stubborn refusal to surrender to despair continued the ancient human tradition of breaking bread together and calling it good. Ellis Brand had found his way home at last, and it was everything he'd dreamed it could be.